The Woman They Called a Fairy, Bridget Cleary and the Murder That Exposed Victorian Ireland. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2025 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without written permission of the author. Preface. This book began with a refusal. A refusal to accept that Bridget Cleary's death could be explained away as superstition. A refusal to accept that belief is ever neutral. And a refusal to allow a woman who fought, resisted, and spoke for herself to be remembered only as a symbol. Bridget Cleary was killed in 1895, in a world that understood doctors, courts, newspapers, and law. She lived in a society that knew how to diagnose illness, how to investigate crime, and how to assign responsibility. Her death did not occur at the margins of modernity. It occurred within it. Yet for more than a century, her story has been told as folklore. She has been called the last witch burned in Ireland, a phrase that distances her from history and relocates violence safely in the past. She has been framed as a tragic casualty of fairy belief, as though belief alone can restrain a woman, force liquid down her throat, threaten her with fire, and burn her body while others watch. This book argues otherwise. Belief did not kill Bridget Cleary. People did. They acted within a system that tolerated the redefinition of women when they became inconvenient. They acted within a marriage that privileged authority over care. They acted within a community that normalized coercion when it could be framed as remedy. And they acted within a legal structure that ultimately chose classification over confrontation. The records that survive, newspaper reports, inquest summaries, trial coverage, are fragmented and imperfect. There is no single transcript that preserves Bridget's voice. What remains instead are descriptions of her resistance, her fear, her attempts to assert who she was while others worked steadily to deny it. This book is built from those fragments. Where the historical record is clear, it is followed closely. Where it is silent, that silence is acknowledged rather than filled with invention. Where folklore appears, it is examined not as explanation, but as instrument, a language that made violence thinkable, speakable, and eventually permissible. This is not a book about fairies. It is a book about what happens when belief aligns with power, when women's autonomy is reinterpreted as pathology, and when institutions respond to sustained violence with hesitation rather than protection. Bridget Cleary was not a myth. She was a working woman, a daughter, a wife, and a person who resisted being erased until resistance itself was used against her. Restoring her to history requires more than retelling her story. It requires refusing the narratives that have softened it. This book is written in that spirit. Not to sensationalize her death, but to take it seriously. Not to romanticize belief, but to interrogate it. And not to preserve a legend, but to return a woman to the historical record she was denied. Chapter 1. A Girl Who Learned to Stand Alone. Bridget Cleary was born Bridget Boland in 1869, in Ballavadlia, a small rural townland outside Clonmel in County Tipperary. What survives of her early life is incomplete, pieced together from parish records, census returns, trial testimony, and newspaper accounts written after her death. Like most working-class Irish women of her generation, Bridget enters history through documents produced by others, priests, doctors, policemen, journalists, each recording what they thought mattered, and rarely what she herself might have chosen to say. What can be established with confidence is that Bridget did not grow up sheltered. Her mother died while Bridget was still young, leaving her father, Patrick Boland, with several children and limited resources. The household was precarious rather than destitute, typical of rural Ireland in the late 19th century, where survival depended on seasonal work, extended family, and the labor of every able body. Childhood, particularly for girls, was brief. Domestic skill, emotional self-reliance, and adaptability were learned early, not encouraged as virtues but demanded as necessities. There is evidence that Bridget spent periods living with relatives, a common practice in rural Ireland and one that shaped her later ease moving between households. This kind of upbringing produced children who learned to adjust quickly, to read social expectations, and to exist under constant observation. It also produced a quiet understanding that security was conditional and could be withdrawn without warning. Bridget received some formal education. She could read and write, which already placed her slightly outside the norm for rural women of her class. Literacy mattered. It allowed independence in correspondence, record-keeping, and contracts, and reduced reliance on others to interpret the world on her behalf. It also fostered a sense of self that extended beyond the immediate domestic sphere. As a young woman, Bridget trained as a dressmaker. This was skilled work, requiring precision, discretion, and reputation. Dressmaking brought her into close contact with other women's lives and bodies, and required movement between households, sometimes for days at a time. It also provided something unusual: income earned directly, without mediation by a father or husband. Economic agency mattered more than later commentary often acknowledged. Bridget earned her own money. She managed her time. She was visible. In a culture that prized female modesty and domestic containment, visibility could easily be recast as impropriety, and independence reframed as defiance. There is no evidence that Bridget was reckless or provocative. She was not known as disruptive or immoral. What she was, by all accounts, was confident. She dressed neatly and fashionably. She spoke plainly. She did not perform submission to put others at ease. Confidence in a woman was often interpreted not as strength of character, but as challenge. Bridget met Michael Cleary through proximity and familiarity rather than romance. In rural Tipperary, people met because they lived near one another, because families overlapped, because church, work, and kinship narrowed the field of possible marriages. Michael lived in the same district around Ballavadlia, close enough that their lives intersected naturally and repeatedly. Clonmel, a market town on the River Suir, sat nearby, larger, busier, and more modern than the surrounding countryside. Bridget's work brought her into households connected to the town as well as the rural hinterland. Michael, a cooper by trade, also moved between rural and semi-urban spaces, supplying barrels and casks to farms and merchants. Their worlds overlapped in an unremarkable way, the kind that rarely leaves a romantic record. Michael was several years older than Bridget, established in his trade and conscious of his standing. Cooperage was skilled, physical work, associated with masculine competence and authority. His identity was bound up in control and craft. Bridget's identity, by contrast, was shaped by movement, negotiation, and independence, quieter forms of agency that unsettled traditional expectations. They married in 1887. There is no indication that Bridget was coerced, nor that the match was considered unsuitable. What is striking, however, is what did not change after the wedding. Bridget continued to work as a dressmaker. She continued to move between households. She did not retreat into domestic invisibility or surrender her income to her husband. They lived primarily in Ballavadlia, close to Michael's relatives. This was not a private household in any meaningful sense. Like many rural marriages, their home existed within a dense network of kin who felt entitled to observe, comment, and intervene. Boundaries were porous. Domestic life was communal, especially when it appeared to deviate from expectation. For a time, the marriage appears to have functioned. There were arguments, later testimony makes this clear, but arguments were not unusual. What mattered was their nature. Michael objected to Bridget's autonomy, particularly her earnings and her refusal to submit automatically. Bridget did not interpret marriage as surrender. That difference in understanding widened quietly, without resolution. Bridget's work meant she was often away from home, staying temporarily with clients or relatives while completing sewing jobs. To her, this was ordinary professional practice. To others, it blurred the boundaries of propriety. A woman who moved freely, who slept in other houses, who did not anchor herself visibly to her husband, invited scrutiny. Scrutiny hardened into judgment. Michael did not need to invent suspicion. The culture provided it ready-made. By the time Bridget fell ill in March 1895, she was already being read through a lens of unease. She was a wife who did not behave as a wife should. She was a woman who did not diminish herself to reassure others. Illness became the moment when that unease demanded explanation. Before any talk of fairies, before any rituals, before the fire, Bridget Cleary was already being reinterpreted. She ceased to be a woman whose words carried weight, and became a problem to be solved. Understanding Bridget's youth, her marriage, and the place she lived strips the case of its false strangeness. This was not an isolated household seized by sudden madness. It was a visible marriage in a watchful place, shaped by expectations that left little room for a woman to define herself on her own terms. The belief came later. The violence came later. The conditions that made both possible were already firmly in place. Chapter 2. Fairies in Ireland, a living belief. Fairies did not belong to the distant past in Victorian Ireland. They were not relics of a medieval imagination lingering on at the edges of modern life. They were present, active, and widely understood as part of the explanatory landscape well into the final decades of the 19th century. By the 1890s, Ireland was a country shaped by contradiction. Railways ran alongside famine memory. British law governed daily life, yet was widely distrusted. Catholicism provided moral structure, while folk belief offered explanation where doctrine fell silent. Education expanded unevenly. Newspapers circulated widely, but oral tradition remained powerful. Fairy belief did not survive in spite of modernity, it survived alongside it. Victorian observers, particularly English journalists and administrators, often misunderstood this coexistence. Fairy belief was framed as evidence of backwardness, a convenient shorthand for Irish irrationality that aligned neatly with colonial stereotypes. Yet Irish commentators and folklorists were more circumspect. They understood that belief functioned less as fantasy than as a shared language, a way of naming misfortune, disorder, and fear without directly confronting their social causes. Fairies explained what could not easily be spoken. They accounted for sudden illness, especially when symptoms were prolonged, cyclical, or resistant to treatment. They explained infertility, infant death, wasting disease, and changes in temperament. They also explained behaviour that disrupted expectation, a woman who refused submission, a child who did not thrive, a man who became volatile or withdrawn. Fairies were not blamed for creating disorder, they were blamed for revealing it. This belief system was deeply embedded in the Irish landscape. Fairy forts, ancient ring forts dotting fields and hills, were treated with caution. They were avoided when ploughing land, skirted when building houses, and spoken of with reverence rather than curiosity. Fairy paths, believed to connect these forts, shaped the orientation of doors and windows. Thresholds, hearths, wells, and crossroads were considered liminal spaces where the human and otherworldly might intersect. These beliefs were not fringe ideas held by a few. They were common knowledge. Even those who professed skepticism often behaved as if the risk were real. The language of belief allowed for ambiguity. One did not need absolute conviction to act cautiously. It was enough to acknowledge possibility. Fairies occupied a moral role in this system. They punished greed, laziness, disrespect, and transgression. They rewarded humility, observance, and conformity. In this sense, fairy belief was conservative rather than rebellious. It reinforced social order. It provided a supernatural rationale for maintaining existing hierarchies and expectations, particularly within family and marriage. Crucially, fairy belief did not replace religion or medicine. It sat alongside both. A person might attend mass, consult a doctor, and still suspect fairy interference if treatment failed or behavior changed. These systems were not mutually exclusive. They addressed different kinds of uncertainty. Medical practice in rural Ireland was uneven. Doctors were scarce, expensive, and often distrusted, particularly by communities who associated institutional authority with eviction, famine, and coercion. Folk belief offered explanations that felt local, inherited, and communal. It belonged to the people who lived there, not to the state that governed them. Colonial pressure helped sustain this belief system. British institutions were experienced not as neutral protectors, but as instruments of control. Law, policing, and poor relief were associated with surveillance and punishment. In this context, folk explanations offered a sense of agency. They allowed communities to respond to crisis internally, using frameworks that felt familiar and morally intelligible. Importantly, belief did not require constant affirmation. It was not a worldview that needed daily rehearsal. Most people could live for years without invoking fairies at all. Belief lay dormant, activated only when ordinary explanations failed or when social tension demanded resolution. This selectivity matters. Fairies were not blamed for every illness or misfortune. They were blamed when misfortune became threatening, when it challenged authority, destabilized relationships, or resisted control. Belief was not random. It was applied strategically, even if unconsciously. Victorian folklore collectors documented this with remarkable consistency. Accounts gathered across Ireland describe similar patterns: illness that lingered, behaviour that shifted, women who spoke too freely or acted too independently, children who failed to conform physically or emotionally. In these cases, fairy explanation offered a way to redefine the problem without questioning social structures themselves. Fairies were also invoked to protect communities from blame. If a child died, if a woman changed, if violence occurred, responsibility could be displaced. Harm became misfortune. Agency blurred. What might otherwise be recognized as neglect, abuse, or cruelty could be reframed as tragic misunderstanding. This displacement of responsibility becomes crucial later. By the late 19th century, fairy belief was already under pressure from modernizing forces. Education, print culture, and urbanization all contributed to its gradual erosion. But erosion does not mean disappearance. Belief systems often persist most strongly at moments of transition, when old certainties fail and new ones have not yet fully taken hold. Ireland in the 1890s was precisely such a place. The country was negotiating its relationship with British rule, grappling with economic instability, and redefining gender roles in subtle but unsettling ways. Women were increasingly visible in paid labor. Migration disrupted traditional family structures. Marriage no longer guaranteed security. These shifts did not dismantle folk belief, they made it more necessary. Fairies offered continuity in a changing world. They provided a story that explained why things felt out of control. By the time Bridget Cleary fell ill, fairy belief did not need to be taught or revived. It was already present, embedded in the language, landscape, and habits of thought that shaped daily life. It required only the right conditions to surface. This chapter matters because it removes the illusion of surprise. What happened to Bridget Cleary did not emerge from nowhere. The belief that would later be used to erase her humanity was already waiting, coherent, familiar, and socially sanctioned. The question was never whether people believed in fairies. The question was when belief would be allowed to outweigh restraint. Chapter 3. Changelings, Women, and the Fear of Difference. If fairies were the explanation, changelings were the accusation. A changeling was not simply a fairy substitute left in place of a human being. In practice, the term functioned as a diagnosis applied to people whose bodies or behavior disrupted expectation. Changelings were not defined by what they were believed to be, but by what they refused to remain. They were people who changed in ways that could not be comfortably accommodated, explained, or controlled. Historically, accusations of changeling replacement clustered around vulnerability. Infants who failed to thrive, children with physical or intellectual disabilities, adults who became ill, withdrawn, or erratic, all could be labeled other. But adult women occupied a particularly dangerous position within this framework, especially married women whose conduct unsettled assumptions about obedience, dependence, and emotional legibility. To be accused of being a changeling was to be stripped of personhood. A changeling was not owed care in the same way a human was. Pain could be inflicted in service of revelation. Violence could be framed as necessity. What would otherwise be recognized as cruelty became intervention. This logic was not unique to Ireland, nor confined to the 19th century. Across Europe, folklore records show similar patterns: women beaten, starved, threatened, or exposed to fire in attempts to force the return of the real wife or child. What distinguishes the Irish context in the late Victorian period is not the existence of these beliefs, but their proximity to modern legal and medical systems, and the willingness of those systems to tolerate their consequences. The changeling accusation operated at the intersection of gender and control. Marriage was a key site of authority in rural Ireland. A wife's body, labor, and behavior were understood as belonging within the marital structure, overseen by the husband and, by extension, the wider kin network. When a woman resisted that structure, whether through illness, independence, or refusal, the changeling narrative provided a way to reinterpret resistance as absence. She was no longer herself. Therefore, she was no longer protected. Illness was often the trigger. Physical weakness, fever, coughing, delirium, or exhaustion could be read not simply as medical symptoms, but as evidence of displacement. This was especially true when illness did not render a woman passive. A woman who was ill yet argumentative, frightened yet defiant, unsettled yet articulate, disrupted the expected script of feminine suffering. In such cases, changeling belief offered coherence. It transformed contradiction into certainty. The woman was not resisting care, she was not truly present. The real wife was elsewhere, waiting to be reclaimed. Rituals designed to expose or expel changelings followed recognizable patterns. Forced ingestion of bitter or foul-tasting mixtures was common, often justified as traditional remedies. Threats were employed to provoke fear or compliance. Isolation was used to weaken resistance. Fire, whether literal or symbolic, occupied a central place. Flames were believed to purify, to compel revelation, to force the fairy impostor to flee. These rituals were rarely private. They required witnesses. Participation was collective, even when only one person delivered the violence. Others observed, advised, or simply remained present. Responsibility was shared, diffused, and thus diminished. Importantly, many changeling cases did not end in death. Violence often stopped short of killing, either because the accused resumed acceptable behavior or because external intervention occurred. These cases rarely entered the historical record precisely because they resolved without fatal consequence. What survives are the extremes, cases where belief overwhelmed restraint entirely. Bridget Cleary's case belongs to this continuum, not outside it. Her vulnerability was not created by belief alone. It was shaped by a convergence of factors that made the changeling narrative plausible to those around her. She was married, yet not submissive. Economically active, yet not dependent. Mobile, articulate, and confident in ways that unsettled traditional hierarchies. When she fell ill, her symptoms did not merely signal physical distress. They became evidence of moral and social disorder. Once the changeling explanation was introduced, it reshaped every interaction. Medical advice could be dismissed as incomplete or misguided. Bridget's protests could be reinterpreted as proof of otherness. Her fear could be taken as confirmation. Each act of resistance strengthened the accusation rather than weakening it. Belief did not act alone. It operated within a system that privileged male authority, distrusted female autonomy, and tolerated violence when it could be framed as corrective rather than punitive. The changeling narrative provided moral cover. It allowed those involved to believe they were acting with purpose, even care. This narrative also served a legal function. When belief was presented as sincere, courts were inclined to treat it as mitigating. Sincerity softened intent. Confusion replaced malice. Responsibility blurred. In this way, folklore did not merely explain violence after the fact, it shaped how that violence was judged. The changeling accusation did not require that everyone involved fully believed in fairies. It required only that belief be plausible enough to suspend doubt, and familiar enough to excuse action. Participation did not depend on conviction so much as acquiescence. By the time Bridget Cleary was accused of being a fairy, the outcome was not inevitable, but it was dangerously possible. The story that would erase her humanity had already been rehearsed many times before, applied to other bodies, other women, other moments of disruption. Changelings were never just about belief. They were about control. And when control failed, belief offered permission to destroy what could not be made to submit. Chapter 4. Illness and Suspicion. Bridget Cleary fell ill in early March 1895. The precise onset of her illness is difficult to establish, not because it went unnoticed, but because it was interpreted through competing lenses from the outset. Witnesses later described weakness, fever, persistent coughing, and exhaustion. At times she appeared confused or breathless. None of these symptoms were unusual in rural Ireland at the end of winter, when respiratory illness was common and medical care limited. What distinguished Bridget's illness was not its nature, but her response to it. She did not submit quietly. She objected to treatment she found distressing. She resisted being restrained. She argued with her husband and with relatives who attempted to control her movements and her body. She moved between households, spending time at her father's home, a practical decision that later acquired sinister significance. Illness, in this context, was never merely physical. It invited authority. A sick woman became a site of interpretation, intervention, and judgment. Her body ceased to belong solely to her. Medical assistance was sought. A local doctor examined Bridget and diagnosed what was likely bronchitis or pneumonia, conditions well known to Victorian medicine and not, in themselves, grounds for alarm. He prescribed conventional remedies and did not suggest that her behavior was abnormal or delusional. At no point did a medical professional propose that Bridget was mentally unsound or other than herself. Medical authority, however, was fragile. Doctors came briefly and departed. Treatment was imperfect. Recovery was uncertain. As days passed without clear improvement, explanations slipped from medicine into belief. Bridget's illness intersected with tensions that already existed within her marriage. Testimony later revealed that Michael Cleary resented her independence long before she became unwell. Her earnings, her movement between households, and her refusal to submit automatically had been sources of friction. Illness did not create suspicion, it activated it. The suggestion that Bridget might be a changeling did not erupt suddenly. It entered conversation gradually, tentatively at first, then repeated until it hardened into conviction. Relatives began to question whether she was truly herself. Her time spent at her father's house was reframed not as care, but as evidence that she had been taken. Language shifted. Bridget was spoken about rather than spoken to. Her words lost authority. Her fear and distress were no longer read as symptoms, but as proof. Once Bridget was no longer recognized as fully herself, violence could be reimagined as remedy. She was subjected to repeated interrogations, questioned about her identity, her marriage, and her loyalty. She was required to affirm that she was Bridget Cleary, and when she resisted or protested, her resistance was taken as failure. These tests were never neutral. They were designed to confirm suspicion, not dispel it. Remedies followed. Bridget was forced to drink mixtures described in court as traditional cures, intended to drive out a fairy imposter. Witnesses differed in their precise descriptions, but they agreed on the effects. The liquids were bitter and distressing. She gagged and vomited. She resisted swallowing them. During some of these episodes, Bridget was restrained. Testimony indicates she was held down while the mixtures were forced into her mouth. Her physical resistance, entirely consistent with fear, illness, and self-preservation, was reinterpreted as unnatural strength. Each attempt to protect her own body deepened the accusation. Threats accompanied these acts. Fire was repeatedly invoked as a means of forcing revelation. Bridget was told that if she were not herself, she would be burned. These threats were not metaphorical or private. They were spoken openly, in front of witnesses, and repeated over several days. The idea of burning her was introduced gradually, normalized through repetition until it became thinkable. Isolation was also used. Bridget was removed from spaces where she might have found support and placed under the control of those who accused her. Her movements were restricted. Her access to sympathetic voices diminished. Fear and exhaustion compounded her illness. The violence escalated incrementally. What began as coercive treatment became punishment. When Bridget protested, she was accused of obstinacy. When she cried out, she was dismissed as deceptive. When she pleaded to be left alone, her pleas were taken as further evidence that she was not herself. This violence was not hidden. It took place in domestic spaces shared by family members and neighbors. People came and went. They witnessed her distress. Some participated directly, others stood by. Responsibility was distributed, diluted by numbers and by belief. Michael Cleary's authority intensified as the situation deteriorated. As husband, he claimed the right to decide whether his wife was herself. He spoke of rescuing her, of bringing her back. He framed his actions as necessary and protective. His authority went largely unchallenged. The final act followed the pattern already established. The use of fire was not spontaneous or accidental. It was the culmination of days of threat, rehearsal, and escalating cruelty. By the time Bridget was burned, her humanity had been systematically eroded. She had been redefined as something that could be destroyed in order to restore order. After her death, Bridget's body was not left where it fell. It was concealed, buried in a shallow grave. This act of concealment complicates later claims of confusion or innocence. Whatever belief was invoked to justify the violence, those involved understood that what had been done was wrong. The truth emerged slowly. Bridget's absence raised questions. Accounts conflicted. Eventually, her remains were discovered. By then, the language of superstition was firmly in place, ready to soften what followed. In the aftermath, those involved leaned heavily on belief. They spoke of fear, of tradition, of misunderstanding. These explanations did not absolve them entirely, but they shaped the response of the law. Bridget Cleary did not die because she was ill. She did not die because people believed in fairies. She died because suspicion was allowed to override restraint, authority was allowed to go unchecked, and violence was permitted to masquerade as care. The fire was not the beginning. It was the final act in a process that had already destroyed her. Chapter 5. The Night of the Fire. The last hours of Bridget Cleary's life began like countless rural evenings had begun before, with darkness settling early, with neighbors close enough to be summoned without effort, with a domestic interior that offered little privacy and even less protection. By the time the final night arrived, the household was already primed for violence. The days leading up to it had established a pattern: Bridget questioned, Bridget accused, Bridget forced to drink, Bridget resisting, resistance reinterpreted as proof. The threat of fire had been spoken aloud often enough that it no longer sounded like an unthinkable act. It sounded like a remedy that had been prepared. In witness testimony, the evening is described not as a sudden explosion but as a continuation. The same beliefs, the same accusations, intensified by fatigue, fear, and the presence of others who made the situation feel sanctioned. The exact hour varies across accounts. Rural households did not run by clocks in the way later retellings assume. But the sequence is consistent. Night falls, people gather, Bridget is confronted again, force is applied, the situation escalates beyond recovery. At roughly the time most households would be settling, after supper, when the fire would be built up for warmth, Bridget was brought into the center of the room, or kept there by those who would not let her retreat. She was ill. She was exhausted. She was frightened. What she needed was rest and care. What she was given was scrutiny. Michael Cleary was not alone. Relatives and neighbors were present at various points of the night. Some accounts place certain individuals in and out, arriving after word was sent, leaving and returning. This movement matters because it makes clear the violence was not hidden. The night was communal in its shape, even when the final act was carried out by one man. Bridget was again pressed to declare who she was. She was asked to affirm her name and identity as though a spoken sentence could restore her safety. In a normal world, her insistence would have been enough. In this one, speech was treated as performance. The wrong tone, the wrong look, the wrong refusal was interpreted as failure. When she resisted, she was restrained. Hands held her. Bodies blocked her. She was prevented from leaving, prevented from refusing what was being forced on her. The remedies were produced again, bitter mixtures, administered with insistence that slid quickly into coercion. The aim was no longer relief. It was submission. If Bridget gagged, it was proof. If she vomited, it was proof. If she fought, it was proof. If she pleaded, it was proof. At some point in the sequence, according to testimony, Michael's certainty sharpened into a kind of dreadful resolve. He framed what he was doing as rescue. He spoke in the language of bringing her back, as though the woman in front of him were not his wife but an obstacle between him and the wife he believed he deserved. The room itself becomes vivid in surviving descriptions. The hearth, the low light, the press of bodies, the sense of a ritual being carried out rather than a crime being committed. This is one of the most chilling features of the case. The violence did not feel, to those participating, like chaos. It felt like action with purpose. Bridget tried to get away. She attempted more than once to move out of reach, to retreat to a corner, to leave the house, to get to someone who might help her. But she was hemmed in by the people around her and by the fact that she was weak with illness. Somewhere in the later part of the evening, the time when fear becomes grim determination, fire ceased being a threat and became a tool. The details of exactly how the flames were applied vary in retellings, but the core action is consistent. Bridget was set alight. Whether through the use of fuel, through contact with the hearth, or through material that caught quickly, the intention was unmistakable. It was not an accident, and it did not happen without forewarning. Fire had been talked into legitimacy before it was used. What followed was not a quiet death. Bridget's screams were heard. Her struggle was witnessed. The aftermath was immediate and terrible. The smell of burning, the chaos of bodies moving, voices raised, the sudden awareness that whatever had been imagined as cure had become undeniable destruction. This is the moment later defenses attempted to blur, the moment they wanted to recast as confusion, as a misapplied folk practice, as an act without understanding. But the behavior after the burning makes clear that understanding existed. Instead of summoning a doctor, instead of sending for authorities, instead of calling in help that would create records and accountability, the priority became control of the narrative. Bridget's body was not left where it fell. It was moved. It was hidden. In the dark hours of the night, While the village slept or pretended not to notice, she was carried away from the domestic interior, where she had been killed and placed where she might not be found quickly. The grave was shallow. The concealment was hurried. The act was not careful enough to erase evidence, but it was deliberate enough to show intent. They knew a line had been crossed, and they knew the law would not call it a ritual. In the time between the killing and the discovery, people spoke carefully. The story was managed. Bridget's absence was treated as something that could be explained away, delayed, blurred into uncertainty. Some said she had gone. Some implied she was away. The idea that she would return, that the real Bridget might still come back, hovered in these accounts like an excuse designed to buy time. Michael Cleary's behaviour in the days following, as recorded in contemporary accounts, shows a man attempting to hold two realities at once, one in which he had committed an unforgivable act, and another in which he had done what was necessary to reclaim his wife. The second reality was useful. It was a shield. It was also, in the end, an indictment, because it framed Bridget's life as something he was entitled to retrieve by force. The night itself did not end neatly. Rural nights rarely do. Darkness lingers, bodies tire, fear settles into silence. But Bridget was already gone, and the people who had witnessed her suffering had chosen, again and again, not to stop it. When dawn came, it did not bring relief. It brought the practical problem of a missing woman and the growing danger of exposure. A community that had participated in violence now faced the possibility of being held accountable for it. That possibility, more than remorse, shaped what happened next. The violence against Bridget Cleary did not occur in a single instant. It unfolded through a sequence of decisions, each one made easier by the last: accusation, restraint, coercion, threat, fire, concealment. By the time the flames rose, the moral work had already been done. Bridget had been redefined as something less than human. The murder was only the final step in that redefinition. Chapter 6. The Missing Woman. Bridget Cleary did not disappear in the way people usually disappear. There was no packed bag, no farewell, no clear destination. What followed the night of the fire was not immediate alarm, but a deliberate, uneasy pause, a space in which explanation was rehearsed and responsibility deferred. In the days after Bridget's death, those involved spoke carefully. Accounts varied, but the underlying strategy was consistent: delay, deflect, and soften. Bridget was described as having gone away. Some suggested she had returned to the fairies. Others implied she might come back. The language was elastic enough to accommodate uncertainty while discouraging scrutiny. This ambiguity mattered. In a rural community accustomed to movement, to seasonal labor, temporary stays with relatives, absences that did not always require explanation, disappearance could be tolerated for a time. But tolerance was not infinite. Michael Cleary's behavior drew attention. According to contemporaneous reporting, he spoke openly of his belief that Bridget would return. He told neighbors that she had been taken, and that the woman burned had not truly been his wife. These statements, intended as justification, instead raised suspicion. They marked him as someone too eager to explain, too ready with a narrative that avoided ordinary grief. The absence of Bridget's body complicated matters. Without it, there could be no burial, no mass, no closure. Death without a body unsettled even those inclined to accept folkloric explanations. Practical concerns intruded. Questions accumulated. A woman could not simply vanish forever without consequence. Eventually, the authorities became involved. Police attention did not descend immediately, nor with urgency. This was not treated as a homicide from the outset. It was a missing person case framed by local testimony that emphasized belief, confusion, and tradition. Still, absence has a way of asserting itself. Bridget had not been seen. She had not written. She had not returned. Pressure mounted. Under questioning, accounts began to shift. Details conflicted. Timelines blurred. What had been described as ritual became harder to separate from violence. What had been framed as rescue began to resemble concealment. The discovery of Bridget's body ended the ambiguity. Her remains were found buried in a shallow grave, hastily concealed. The location itself spoke volumes. This was not a place of reverence or care. It was a place chosen to hide what should not be seen. The burial was insufficient to prevent discovery, but adequate to delay it. Delay had been the goal. The condition of the body confirmed what belief had attempted to obscure. Bridget had been burned. The violence was no longer hypothetical or symbolic. It was physical, undeniable, and fatal. At this point, the tone of the investigation changed. The discovery forced a shift from explanation to accountability. The story could no longer be held together by folklore alone. The law demanded facts: who was present, who acted, who restrained, who watched, who failed to intervene. Arrests followed. Michael Cleary was taken into custody, along with several relatives and neighbors who had participated in or witnessed the events leading to Bridget's death. The breadth of those arrested reflected the collective nature of the crime. This was not a single act carried out in isolation. It had unfolded in company. Statements were taken. Witnesses spoke, some defensively, some evasively, some with an air of resignation. Belief was again invoked, now as mitigation rather than explanation. Those questioned emphasized fear, confusion, tradition. Few spoke of anger or control. Violence was reframed as misapplied care. The coroner's inquest followed, drawing on testimony that had already begun to harden into familiar patterns. The language used in these proceedings is revealing. Bridget was discussed less as a woman than as a problem. Her suffering was secondary to the question of intent. Did those involved mean to kill her? This question dominated the early legal framing, and it would shape everything that followed. Victorian law required intent for a murder conviction. Belief complicated intent. If the accused genuinely believed Bridget was a changeling, then, so the argument went, their actions, however tragic, were not malicious in the conventional sense. This reasoning did not absolve them, but it softened the ground. The inquest established that Bridget had died as a result of burning inflicted by others. That fact could not be denied. But the interpretation of that fact remained contested. Was this murder? Or was it a fatal mistake made in ignorance? The question itself reveals the limits of the system confronting the case. Throughout the early stages of the investigation, institutional caution is evident. Police, coroners, and legal officials moved carefully, aware that the case touched on belief, custom, and community. Aggressive prosecution risked backlash. Excessive sympathy risked injustice. The path chosen attempted to balance both, and in doing so, satisfied neither fully. Bridget Cleary, once again, was not the center of the process. By the time formal charges were laid, the story had already been shaped. Newspapers had framed the case as extraordinary, sensational, and folkloric. Public fascination grew. The image of the fairy woman captured attention more readily than the reality of prolonged domestic torture. This framing mattered. It influenced how jurors would later hear the case. It influenced how responsibility would be apportioned. It influenced which acts were emphasized and which were softened. What emerged from the investigation was a picture both clearer and more troubling than the folklore allowed. Bridget had been ill. She had been restrained. She had been threatened. She had been tortured over several days. She had been burned deliberately. Her body had been concealed. None of this required belief to explain it. Yet belief remained central, because it offered a way for the system to look at these facts and still hesitate. Chapter 7. The trial begins. When the case of Bridget Cleary reached the courtroom in Clonmel in April 1895, it arrived already burdened with meaning. The facts of her death were no longer in dispute. Bridget Cleary was dead. She had been burned. Her body had been concealed. What remained unresolved, and what the trial would ultimately turn upon, was how responsibility would be distributed, and how belief would be weighed against violence. Michael Cleary stood at the center of the proceedings. As Bridget's husband, he was charged with her killing, along with several relatives and neighbors accused of participating in or facilitating the acts that led to her death. Contemporary reporting lists multiple defendants, reflecting the collective nature of the violence. Some were accused of direct involvement. Others were charged with aiding, abetting, or failing to intervene. The courtroom was crowded. Reporters from Irish and British newspapers filled the benches. The case had already attracted national attention. Headlines emphasized folklore, superstition, and the sensational language of fairy belief, often at the expense of Bridget herself. The atmosphere was not neutral. Curiosity and judgment mingled freely. Michael Cleary's demeanor was remarked upon almost immediately. Witnesses described him as composed, even resolute. He did not present as a man overtaken by grief. Instead, he framed himself as a husband who had acted under conviction, a man who believed his wife had been taken, and who had attempted to recover her. This framing mattered. The prosecution's task was complicated by the defense's reliance on belief. If Michael Cleary could persuade the court that he genuinely believed Bridget was not herself, then intent, the cornerstone of a murder conviction, became difficult to establish. The prosecution began by laying out the sequence of events leading up to Bridget's death: her illness, the interrogations, the forced remedies, the threats, and the final burning. Witness after witness confirmed that Bridget had been restrained, distressed, and terrified. Bridget's father, Patrick Boland, gave evidence. His testimony was among the most painful. He described his daughter's illness, her fear, and her attempts to escape the situation. He spoke of her being forced to drink mixtures and of her resistance. His evidence established that Bridget had repeatedly asserted her identity and begged to be left alone. Boland's testimony cut through the language of belief. He did not speak of fairies. He spoke of his daughter. Medical witnesses followed. The doctor who had attended Bridget prior to her death confirmed that she was suffering from a physical illness consistent with bronchitis or pneumonia. He stated clearly that there was no medical basis for believing she was mentally unsound or other than herself. This evidence directly undermined claims that Bridget's behaviour was inexplicable or supernatural. The defense did not contest the doctor's diagnosis. Instead, it attempted to sidestep it. Belief, not medicine, was the cornerstone of their case. Several neighbors and relatives gave evidence describing the rituals carried out in the days before Bridget's death. Their accounts varied in detail but were consistent in structure. Bridget had been questioned. She had been given remedies. She had resisted. Fire had been spoken of as a means of forcing revelation. Some witnesses attempted to minimize their role. Others described events with a troubling lack of emotional engagement, speaking of violence as though it were procedure rather than assault. One recurring figure in these accounts was Johanna Burke, a relative present during several key episodes. Her testimony placed her at the scene during the interrogations and the administration of remedies. She described the belief that Bridget was a changeling and the actions taken in response. Her evidence helped establish the communal nature of the violence. William Cleary, Michael's father, was also named in contemporary reporting as present during critical moments. Testimony suggested that he was aware of the threats made against Bridget and did not intervene to stop them. His presence reinforced the prosecution's argument that authority and acquiescence extended beyond a single individual. Throughout the trial, the defense returned repeatedly to the language of sincerity. Michael Cleary testified in his own defense. He stated that he believed his wife had been taken by fairies and that the woman burned was not truly Bridget. He spoke of fear rather than anger, of rescue rather than punishment. He did not deny the burning. He denied its meaning. This distinction lay at the heart of the case. The prosecution pressed him on his actions after Bridget's death. Why, if he believed he was acting rightly, had he concealed her body? Why had he not summoned a doctor or priest? Why had he spoken of her return rather than her death? These questions exposed cracks in the narrative of confusion. The concealment of Bridget's body was especially damaging. It suggested awareness, not of belief, but of wrongdoing. The defense attempted to frame this as panic rather than intent, but the implication remained. As the trial progressed, the court was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Belief could explain why violence occurred, but it could not erase the violence itself. The question became how far belief could be allowed to mitigate responsibility. The judge's instructions to the jury reflected this tension. Jurors were asked to consider whether the accused had acted with intent to kill, or whether they had acted under a sincere but mistaken belief. The framing invited sympathy without demanding accountability. Bridget Cleary, whose voice had been silenced long before she died, was largely absent from this stage of the proceedings. Her suffering was acknowledged, but not centered. The trial was not about her life. It was about the limits of belief. When the jury retired, the outcome remained uncertain. The facts were brutal. The law was cautious. The story presented to the jury was one in which violence had been reframed as tragic error rather than deliberate destruction. The verdict would reveal which interpretation the court was willing to accept. Chapter 8. The verdict in Bridget Cleary's case did not turn on whether she died. That fact was no longer contested. It turned instead on whether the law was prepared to say, without qualification, that she had been murdered. When the jury retired at Clonmel in April 1895, they did so having heard evidence of sustained violence inflicted over several days. They had heard that Bridget Cleary had been interrogated, restrained, threatened, force-fed bitter mixtures, and finally burned. They had also been offered a narrative, repeated by the defense and tolerated by the court, that the woman subjected to this violence was not, in some essential sense, Bridget at all. At the center of the case stood Michael Cleary, Bridget's husband. He was the principal accused and the person who applied the fatal violence. Alongside him were charged several others who had participated in, facilitated, or failed to prevent what occurred. Among those named in contemporary reporting were William Cleary, Michael's father, Johanna Burke, a relative present during the interrogations and administration of remedies, and other neighbors and kin whose involvement varied in degree but not in consequence. Victorian homicide law was not concerned solely with outcome. It was preoccupied with intention. Murder required proof that the accused intended to kill or intended to cause grievous bodily harm of a kind likely to result in death. Manslaughter, by contrast, covered unlawful killings where that mental element could not be established to the jury's satisfaction. The distinction was decisive. It determined not only sentence, but moral classification. The defense's strategy was to collapse that distinction. Michael Cleary did not deny burning Bridget. He denied its meaning. He told the court that he believed his wife had been taken by fairies and replaced with a changeling. The person he burned, he insisted, was not Bridget Cleary. His intention, he claimed, was not to kill his wife, but to force the return of the real woman who had been taken from him. This claim, grotesque as it was, created legal space. If the jury accepted that Michael Cleary genuinely held this belief, then they could doubt whether he possessed the intent required for murder, even while acknowledging that his actions were violent and unlawful. The prosecution attempted to close that space by emphasizing sequence and conduct. Bridget had been ill, not mad. A doctor had attended her and found nothing supernatural or delusional in her condition. She had repeatedly identified herself. She had begged to be left alone. She had resisted coercion in ways entirely consistent with fear and self-preservation. Her father, Patrick Boland, gave evidence that cut through the language of belief. He spoke of his daughter's terror, of her resistance to being forced to drink remedies, and of her pleas to be spared further abuse. His testimony grounded the case in human suffering rather than superstition. Medical evidence further undermined the defense narrative. The doctor who examined Bridget confirmed that she was suffering from a recognizable physical illness, likely bronchitis or pneumonia. He stated plainly that there was no medical basis for concluding she was mentally unsound or other than herself. This evidence was not seriously challenged. What complicated matters was not a lack of facts, but the presence of belief as a mitigating explanation. Witnesses including Johanna Burke described the rituals carried out in the days before Bridget's death, the interrogations, the forced remedies, the threats of fire. Their testimony was often delivered without visible emotional engagement, as though recounting procedure rather than abuse. The cumulative effect was to normalize violence through repetition. William Cleary, Michael's father, was identified as present during critical moments and aware of the threats made against Bridget. His failure to intervene reinforced the prosecution's argument that authority and acquiescence extended beyond a single individual. This was not a solitary act. It was a collective one. Michael Cleary's own testimony was the fulcrum of the trial. He told the court that as Bridget burned, he believed he was not burning his wife. Contemporary newspaper reports preserved his words with chilling clarity. "It is not my wife," he was reported as saying. In another account he declared, "It is not Bridget I am burning." These statements were intended to demonstrate sincerity of belief. They also revealed a profound erasure of Bridget's humanity. The prosecution pressed him on his actions after the burning. Why, if he believed he was acting rightly, did he conceal the body? Why did he not summon a doctor or priest? Why did he speak of Bridget's return rather than acknowledge her death? The concealment of the body proved especially damaging. Bridget's remains were buried hastily in a shallow grave. This act suggested awareness that a crime had been committed. The defense attempted to frame concealment as panic rather than consciousness of guilt, but the implication remained. Belief did not erase knowledge of wrongdoing. When the judge addressed the jury, his directions reflected the central tension of the case. Jurors were instructed to consider whether the accused had acted with intent to kill, or whether they had acted under a sincere but mistaken belief. The framing did not require the jury to approve of the belief. It required them to decide whether it prevented the formation of murderous intent. This framing offered the jury a way out. Victorian juries were not abstract legal machines. They were moral filters, drawn from the same society that had produced the beliefs under examination. Faced with a choice between murder and manslaughter, they could condemn the act without embracing its full moral implication. Manslaughter became the compromise verdict. Michael Cleary was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to penal servitude for a lengthy term, commonly reported as 20 years. Others involved received lesser sentences for related offenses, reflecting the court's attempt to distribute responsibility without naming the killing as murder. The verdict did not mean the jury believed Bridget's death was accidental. It meant they accepted, or at least tolerated, a narrative in which belief complicated intent enough to prevent a murder conviction. It meant the law was willing to treat prolonged domestic torture, followed by burning, as a tragic misapplication of custom, rather than a deliberate killing. Bridget Cleary's trial is often remembered for its folklore. What it actually reveals is something more ordinary and more troubling. The legal system turned a woman's sustained abuse into an argument about a man's mind. In doing so, it found the language that allowed it to condemn without fully confronting what had been done. Guilty, but not murder. Chapter 9. The end of the trial did not bring clarity. It brought closure of a particular kind, the kind that satisfies legal process without resolving moral discomfort. Michael Cleary was sentenced to penal servitude for manslaughter. Contemporary reports most often cite a term of 20 years, though some variation appears in early newspaper summaries. What is consistent is the court's emphasis on punishment without full condemnation. Michael was not treated as a murderer, but neither was he excused. He was framed as a man who had acted under belief, and whose belief had led him fatally astray. Others convicted in connection with Bridget Cleary's death received lesser sentences. William Cleary, Michael's father, and Johanna Burke, among others, were punished for their roles in the events leading up to the killing, for participation, presence, or failure to intervene. The sentences reflected degrees of involvement rather than degrees of suffering. Bridget's experience remained fragmented across charges and outcomes. Patrick Boland, Bridget's father, left the courtroom having secured a conviction, but not justice in any sense he would have recognized. His daughter had been tortured, burned, and buried in secret. The law had responded by carefully calibrating blame until it no longer matched harm. Outside the courtroom, public reaction unfolded unevenly. Irish newspapers reported the verdict with a mixture of condemnation and fascination. Editorials expressed horror at the events, while often softening their language with references to superstition and ignorance. Bridget herself was increasingly described not as a woman, but as a case, an example of what could happen when belief overpowered reason. British newspapers took a different tone. Coverage in London papers framed the case as evidence of rural barbarism, reinforcing colonial narratives about Irish backwardness. The violence done to Bridget Cleary was transformed into a cautionary tale about a country rather than a crime against a person. Responsibility was displaced once again, this time from individuals to culture. In both contexts, Bridget began to disappear. Her name remained, but her life receded. She was no longer discussed as a dressmaker, a daughter, or a wife who had earned her own living. She became the fairy woman, the changeling wife, the last witch burned. Each label carried spectacle but stripped agency. The language that had enabled her death continued to shape how she was remembered. Michael Cleary was transferred into the penal system. Records of his imprisonment are sparse, as was typical for men convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. He served a substantial portion of his sentence. By the time he was released, Ireland had changed. The world that had made belief legible in court was beginning to recede, replaced by new political and social upheavals. There is no evidence that Michael Cleary ever publicly recanted his belief. Some reports suggest he continued to insist that he had acted to save his wife. Whether this represented genuine conviction or a narrative he could no longer abandon is impossible to determine. What is clear is that his version of events survived longer than Bridget's. The other defendants faded quickly from public attention. Their names appeared briefly in sentencing reports and then vanished. Collective violence, once punished, becomes difficult to narrate. History prefers singular villains or singular victims. The truth of Bridget's death resisted both categories. Patrick Boland did not regain his daughter. He did not regain her reputation. He watched as her story was retold and reshaped by people who had never known her. For families like his, the aftermath of such a case did not end with a verdict. It lingered in the knowledge that the law had spoken, and that what it had said was insufficient. Over time, the case entered folklore itself. Songs, stories, and later retellings folded Bridget Cleary back into the very belief system that had helped to kill her. She became a symbol rather than a person, a cautionary figure rather than a woman who had lived, worked, argued, and resisted. The irony is cruel and exact. A woman destroyed by myth was preserved as myth. What the legal aftermath reveals most starkly is not the persistence of superstition, but the flexibility of the law when confronted with it. The court did not deny the violence. It reclassified it. It found a language that allowed it to punish without fully naming what had occurred. Bridget Cleary's death did not end with fire. It continued in the careful way her killing was absorbed into narrative, softened by belief, and distributed across a community until no single hand seemed fully responsible. The verdict closed the case. The consequences did not end there. Chapter 10. The death of Bridget Cleary did not remain confined to the facts of her life or the findings of her trial. Almost immediately, it began to change shape. What followed was not remembrance, but transformation. In the years after the verdict, Bridget Cleary ceased to exist in public memory as a woman with a childhood, a trade, a marriage, and a voice. She was remade into a symbol. The process was gradual, uneven, and revealing. Each retelling carried her further away from who she had been and closer to what others needed her to represent. Newspapers played the first and most decisive role. Irish and British press accounts continued to revisit the case long after the trial ended, often stripping away legal nuance in favor of shorthand. Bridget became the fairy woman, the changeling wife, or most persistently, the last woman burned as a witch in Ireland. The phrase was inaccurate, but it was irresistible. It collapsed history into spectacle and absolved the present by locating violence safely in a mythic past. That phrase did particular damage. It suggested that Bridget's death was an echo of medieval barbarism rather than a product of late Victorian society. It implied distance, inevitability, and cultural inevitability rather than responsibility. The violence that had unfolded in full view of doctors, police, and courts was reframed as something archaic, something already disappearing. In this version of events, Bridget did not die because people failed her. She died because Ireland was behind. Michael Cleary, meanwhile, was quietly receding from view. He served his sentence and emerged into a world increasingly uninterested in his individual guilt. His name survived in records, but his role was often softened in popular retellings. He became a figure of belief rather than violence, confusion rather than choice. Others involved in Bridget's death disappeared almost entirely. William Cleary, Johanna Burke, and the neighbors who witnessed, restrained, advised, or failed to intervene faded into anonymity. Collective violence does not sit comfortably in narrative. It resists clean moral structure. History prefers a single villain or a single superstition. The truth, that many people participated, acquiesced, or watched, proved harder to sustain. As the decades passed, folklore scholars, writers, and cultural commentators returned to Bridget Cleary's story with new interests and new frameworks. Some treated her as a victim of superstition alone, a casualty of fairy belief detached from gender, marriage, and authority. Others framed the case as a tragedy of misunderstanding, a collision between belief systems rather than a sustained act of domestic terror. What was often missing was Bridget herself. Her independence, her work as a dressmaker, her resistance to submission, and her repeated attempts to assert her identity were frequently reduced to footnotes, if they appeared at all. In many retellings, Bridget became passive, acted upon rather than acting, silent rather than protesting. The violence inflicted on her body was remembered more clearly than the agency she exercised until it was forcibly taken from her. This erasure was not accidental. It mirrored the logic that had enabled her death. Belief had not killed Bridget Cleary on its own. Belief had been used to explain away a woman who would not comply. Later narratives repeated that pattern by explaining away her autonomy in favor of myth. The case also took on a political life it had never possessed during Bridget's lifetime. British commentators continued to cite it as evidence of Irish backwardness, reinforcing colonial stereotypes that cast violence as cultural rather than individual. Irish commentators, wary of this framing, sometimes softened their critique, emphasizing superstition while downplaying institutional failure. In both cases, the law escaped sustained scrutiny. Rarely did later discussions dwell on the fact that doctors visited Bridget and left her unprotected, that police were nearby and slow to intervene, or that a jury heard evidence of prolonged torture and still declined to name it murder. These failures were less compelling than folklore. They required confronting uncomfortable truths about how systems behave when belief aligns with power. Bridget Cleary's legacy is therefore fractured. She is remembered, but not consistently understood. She is cited, but often simplified. She is invoked as warning, symbol, or story, but rarely as a woman whose life and death expose how easily violence becomes permissible when authority goes unchecked. Yet her case endures because it refuses to disappear entirely. Each return to the record reveals the same pattern: a woman asserting autonomy, a community unsettled by that assertion, belief deployed to reassert control, violence normalized through repetition, and a legal system that chose classification over confrontation. Bridget Cleary was not the last woman harmed by superstition. She was not the last woman harmed by marriage. She was not the last woman harmed by belief. What makes her case persist is not its strangeness, but its familiarity. The language has changed. The explanations have evolved. But the underlying structure, the readiness to reinterpret women's resistance as pathology, to treat violence as correction, and to soften accountability when perpetrators claim belief, remains recognizable. Bridget Cleary did not become a legend because she was unreal. She became a legend because the truth of what was done to her was too difficult to hold without myth. This book returns her to history not as a fairy, not as a witch, and not as a cautionary tale, but as a woman whose death exposes how societies choose which lives are fully protected, and which can be explained away. That is her legacy. Chapter 11. The week before the fire. The week before Bridget Cleary died did not begin in flames. It began in illness. This is important, because what happened in that cottage did not appear, to those inside it, as sudden madness. It unfolded as a series of escalating corrections. Small acts, small urgencies, small justifications. Each one, in isolation, explainable. Together, fatal. Bridget had been unwell for days. Accounts differ on the exact nature of her symptoms, but most describe weakness, fever, confusion, irritability. She had recently been caught in cold rain. She had been working hard. She was exhausted. But illness in rural Ireland in 1895 was not just medical. It was moral. It was spiritual. It was communal. And for women, especially women who earned their own money, moved freely, and did not conform, illness could quickly become suspicion. Bridget was not a fragile cottage wife. She was literate. She ran her own poultry trade. She dressed well. She moved between town and countryside with confidence. She did not shrink. And when she fell ill, something else began to circulate alongside concern. She was not herself. That phrase matters. Because not herself is the doorway through which folklore walks in. The first shift, personality. Witnesses later described her as changed. She spoke sharply. She resisted treatment. She did not respond as expected. Today, we would read this as fever delirium. In 1895, the interpretive framework was different. If a person's behavior altered, especially suddenly, explanations were drawn from a cultural vocabulary that had been rehearsed for generations. In that vocabulary, there existed a concept both terrifying and familiar. The changeling. Not metaphorical. Literal. The belief held that fairies, or the good people, could steal a human and leave behind something else. A substitute. A sickly imitation. A body that looked right but behaved wrong. And the most vulnerable to replacement. Women. Children. The sick. Bridget fit the category. The role of Michael Cleary. Michael Cleary, her husband, has often been painted in simple terms: jealous, domineering, unstable. But simplification obscures structure. Michael was a cooper, skilled, literate, connected to town commerce. He was not a wild-eyed peasant lost in superstition. He lived at the intersection of tradition and modernity. And that is precisely why the case unsettles historians. Because this was not a remote medieval survival. This was 1895. Railways ran. Newspapers circulated. Courts functioned. And yet inside a cottage, a man asked his wife, "Are you my wife, Bridget?" Not once. Repeatedly. The question was ritualistic. He was not asking for reassurance. He was demanding confirmation of identity. And she did not answer correctly. Because there was no correct answer once suspicion had taken hold. Escalation as process. Violence did not erupt instantly. It built. Bridget was forced to swallow foul mixtures, herbs, milk, possibly urine. Folk cures meant to expel what did not belong. She was held down, threatened, interrogated. Visitors came and went. No one stopped it. That detail matters most. This was not a secret act committed in isolation. People witnessed her treatment. People heard her protests. People believed, or half believed, or feared enough not to intervene. The week before the fire is a study in diffusion of responsibility. Each person inside the cottage likely believed they were not the primary actor. They were assisting, observing, allowing, deferring to the husband, deferring to custom, deferring to the possibility, however remote, that this was necessary. Folklore does not operate as individual madness. It operates as shared permission. Chapter 12. The Interrogation Ritual. The question that haunts this case is not only why violence happened, but how it was framed while it was happening. Because inside that cottage, what took place was not treated as an assault. It was treated as a test, a procedure, a spiritual audit. If you want to understand why this kind of event could become common in Ireland, not necessarily the burning, but the logic that leads to coercion, you have to understand the ritual shape of it. The interrogation is the hinge. It is the moment the story stops being a sick woman in a bed and becomes a suspected substitute. Identity as a question, not a fact. In a modern worldview, identity is stable. This is my wife, even if she is ill. In the changeling worldview, identity is contingent. This looks like my wife, but might not be her. The body becomes suspicious. And because the body is suspicious, proof must be extracted. That's the core mechanism. A person is observed to be not themselves. That difference is framed as replacement. The community treats the replacement as something that can be confronted, tricked, forced, expelled. Violence is reclassified as a method. Bridget's identity, then, wasn't assumed. It was litigated. The cottage as courtroom. Witness accounts, and the way later testimony was spoken, suggest the cottage became a kind of informal tribunal. Michael Cleary took on the role of examiner. Others became witnesses. The priest became an authority whose presence mattered even if he did not directly command the violence. Neighbors, family members, even those who doubted, became the crucial ingredient, an audience. This matters because violence is easier in front of others when it can be presented as duty rather than cruelty. Michael did not have to appear like a monster. He could appear like a man doing something unbearable but necessary. That is how the story was told later. But that story was rehearsed during the event itself. Folk medicine as moral discipline. Bridget was forced to take mixtures. Some were framed as cures. Some as tests. The line between medicine and punishment becomes thin in folklore logic. When a cure is administered with consent, it is care. When a cure is administered by force, it is control. Yet the language of cure allows coercion to masquerade as concern. If Bridget refused treatment, refusal itself was read as evidence. A sick woman might resist because she is delirious. A fairy might resist because the cure threatens it. So resistance became incriminating. A trap with no exit. The role of the priest. The priest's involvement in the Bridget Cleary case is often discussed with either outrage or minimization, but the structural point is this: religious authority sat alongside folk authority without fully displacing it. In many rural Irish communities in the 19th century, Catholicism did not erase older beliefs. It layered on top of them. People could hold both at once. They could believe in sacraments and fairies. They could seek a priest's blessing and still fear a fairy fort. What a priest said mattered, but it was not always decisive. Because the priest represented the official spiritual order. And the folklore order operated locally, embedded in land, family, and communal memory. So if a priest offered prayers or rites, it did not necessarily close the case. For some, it might have confirmed the danger. For others, it might have provided a respectable cover for the event. Either way, his presence contributed to the sense that this situation was not ordinary sickness. It was a spiritual crisis. Say you are Bridget. One of the most chilling features of this case is the demand for verbal confirmation. Michael demanded she speak the words that would restore her identity. But this is never simply about words. It is about submission. If Bridget complied, she would be seen as returning. If she did not, she would be seen as refusing. But even compliance can be folded into suspicion. A fairy could mimic. A fairy could lie. Which means the verbal test can never really prove anything. Its function is not proof. Its function is permission. Once a person is forced to answer, and the answer is rejected, violence becomes justified as next step. The mythic logic of extraction. The changeling belief includes the idea that the true person is not dead. They are taken, held somewhere else, and there are methods to force their return. Those methods are often described like bargaining tools. Terrorize the changeling so the fairies give the real person back. Threaten destruction. Perform a ritual that makes the substitute unbearable to keep. This is why violence can be framed as rescue. Not punishment, but retrieval. Michael Cleary later spoke as though he believed his wife could still return, as if her disappearance would be temporary if the ritual succeeded. That belief makes the act both more horrifying and more comprehensible within its framework. Because if you truly believe a person has been taken, you may believe extreme measures are necessary to get them back. That does not excuse. But it explains why the violence can carry a strange, purposeful tone, not random rage, but ritual insistence. Group psychology. Doubt does not prevent participation. A common misconception is that people who participated must have been full believers. In reality, group events often involve a spectrum. True believers. Half-believers. Fear-driven participants. Those who comply because resisting the group is socially dangerous. Those who comply because what if it's true? That last one is often the most potent. Because it creates a moral risk calculation. If you intervene and stop the ritual, and the belief is true, you are responsible for abandoning the real woman to the fairies. If you do nothing, and it is false, you are still only complicit. The human mind will choose the option that feels less spiritually catastrophic. That is how superstition weaponizes hesitation. Bridget's position, a woman with no authority in the room. Bridget was not the adjudicator of her own identity. She was the accused. Her husband's voice carried legal weight and cultural weight. A sick woman's refusal could be dismissed as hysteria, stubbornness, witchcraft, or fairy influence. Even if she spoke calmly, she was still in a structurally weaker position. And because she was in a weaker position, she could not reframe the narrative. She could not say, "I am ill." Because illness had already been reinterpreted. She could not say, "You are hurting me." Because hurt had been relabeled as cure. This is the core cruelty of folkloric violence. It hijacks language. It steals meanings. And it leaves the victim without usable words. Chapter 13. The Night of the Burning. The night Bridget Cleary died was not a spontaneous accident. It was the end of a trajectory. And when the fire came, it did not erase uncertainty. It solidified it. Because fire is the most final form of purification the human imagination has ever used. And in folklore logic, purification is never gentle. The threshold moment. In many accounts of changeling folklore, the threshold is a key idea. A person is taken at a threshold. Between day and night. Between illness and recovery. Between childhood and adulthood. Between marriage and independence. Between home and outside world. Bridget was already on thresholds. Her illness put her between life and death. Her social position, independent, employed, mobile, put her between rural tradition and modern autonomy. When she became suspicious, she became symbolically unanchored. That's why her body could be treated like a site of struggle. She was not just Bridget. She became a battleground for what was right order. Why fire? In Irish folk belief, fire has two uses. Protection, keeping harmful spirits away. Exposure, forcing hidden things to reveal themselves. Fire is also irreversible. That's why it becomes attractive in panic narratives. It creates a sense of decisive action. It feels like certainty. And in moments of fear, certainty is intoxicating. Michael Cleary's later insistence that his real wife would return, that Bridget was not truly gone, becomes grotesquely linked with fire logic. If the substitute is destroyed, the real one will come back. Fire becomes not murder, but release. That is how a husband can stand over his wife and still believe he is acting as a rescuer. Again, not an excuse. A mechanism. The act as performance. It matters that other people were nearby. It matters that people knew. Because violence in folklore settings often becomes performative. Not because the perpetrator wants spectacle, but because the ritual requires social witness. A ritual without witnesses can be dismissed as madness. A ritual with witnesses becomes tradition. It becomes collective. The crowd doesn't have to cheer to be part of it. They only have to remain. Their presence is a kind of endorsement. And their silence becomes part of the structure that later allows the story to be told as strange tragedy, rather than straightforward homicide. Bridget's last moments. Bridget's last moments cannot be known with the clarity we wish for. But the elements are consistent. She was weak. She was frightened. She was restrained. The fire was not an accident. She did not catch a light. She was burned. However the precise sequence unfolded, the key point is that by this moment, the people involved no longer treated her as a full person with rights. They treated her as an object of spiritual management. That is the true psychological crossing. Once someone becomes not really them, harm becomes easier. Because the moral barrier is lowered. The afterthought, she will come back. This is perhaps the strangest part. After death, Michael's reported insistence that his wife would return suggests he imagined a reversible reality. In changeling stories, the real person often returns after the substitute is punished. The fairy world is imagined like a parallel jurisdiction. If you apply the correct pressure, it yields. The belief creates a world where one can commit irreversible violence while still imagining the outcome will be reparative. That is what makes the case feel surreal. A man kills his wife and speaks as though the real wife is still recoverable. That isn't only cruelty. It is delusion shaped by narrative tradition. Chapter 14. After the smoke, concealment and community silence. The morning after violence is rarely loud. It is quiet. It is full of practical decisions that feel small at the time but become enormous later, not because of what they are, but because of what they reveal. In the Bridget Cleary case, what happened after the fire matters as much as the fire itself, because it exposes the real machinery beneath the folklore, the machinery of concealment, reputation, and community self-protection. If folklore is the spark, silence is the fuel. Where does a body go when a community doesn't want a story? There is a reason so many historical cases become mysterious. Often, the mystery is manufactured. A body is moved. A report is delayed. A search is confused. A witness doesn't remember. A neighbor didn't see. In small communities, secrecy does not require a conspiracy. It requires only a shared understanding. If we speak, the village becomes a headline. If we speak, the priest becomes implicated. If we speak, the family becomes ruined. If we speak, the men become criminals. So speaking becomes dangerous. And danger produces silence. Bridget's death did not instantly become a public tragedy. It became a local problem to be managed. The myth of the private crime. This case is often described as a domestic killing that spilled into the public realm. But that framing hides an important truth. It was never entirely private. People knew. People had visited. People had heard. People were aware that Bridget was being treated. The cottage was porous. The community had access. Which means the aftermath wasn't simply the husband hiding his act. It was the community negotiating its relationship to an act it had allowed to unfold. That negotiation usually produces a predictable pattern. Minimization, it wasn't what people are saying. Deflection, it was a misunderstanding/an accident. Fragmentation, each person claims they only saw a small part. Moral distancing, we tried to help, we were afraid, we didn't know. Reclassification, folklore becomes superstition, and superstition becomes tragic ignorance. These are not lies in the simple sense. They are survival strategies. Community silence as self-defense. The press later framed the case as sensational, a barbaric relic, a weird rural eruption. But inside the village, the first instinct would have been reputation management. Not because everyone approved of what happened, but because everyone understood what public attention could do. Public attention could attract police scrutiny, invite ridicule from outsiders, threaten parish authority, damage commerce, reduce marriage prospects, label the region as backward. A village is not just a place people live. It is an ecosystem. And ecosystems protect themselves. That protection often happens at the expense of the victim. The practicality of disposal. There is a cold practicality in how communities handle an event they cannot morally integrate. If the act can be made ambiguous, it becomes tolerable. If it stays clear, it is intolerable. So ambiguity becomes a tool. A buried body in a hidden place does two things: removes the immediate evidence, creates the possibility of narrative drift. People can say, "She ran away. She went to relatives. She disappeared. She wasn't right anyway. She wasn't herself." And each retelling adds distance. Distance becomes doubt. Doubt becomes safety. The role of gender in silence. Women often carry stories. Women often transmit warnings. But women also bear social punishment for disruption. In communities where male authority and church authority intertwine, women may know what happened and still avoid naming it openly. Because naming it does not only accuse a man, it accuses the community's power structure. And accusations rarely stop at the perpetrator. They ripple. That is why a woman like Bridget, independent, visible, too modern, could become vulnerable in life. And vulnerable in death. Because even when she was gone, speaking for her required social courage. When the state arrives, once police and courts become involved, the community shifts again. Now silence is not only moral, it is legal. People fear being implicated. They fear being accused of participation. They fear being revealed as believers. And belief is not socially neutral in 1895 Ireland. Belief is evidence of backwardness, evidence of ignorance, evidence of moral failure. So witnesses often present themselves as reluctant. "I only came for a moment. I thought she was sick. I didn't understand. I tried to help." Every statement is shaped by an awareness. The public is listening now. The record is permanent. The shock of the outside world. The outside world is always shocked by the inside world. That's part of how modernity defines itself. Look at those superstitious people. We are not like them. The press thrives on this contrast. But the inside world experiences the outside world's attention differently. Not as justice. As humiliation. That humiliation can harden silence. It can make a community close ranks. It can make witnesses protect perpetrators not because they approve, but because the alternative is collective shame. This is why sensational coverage sometimes delays accountability. Because shame is not the same as remorse. Shame makes people hide. Bridget becomes a symbol. Once the story escapes the village, Bridget stops being a complicated woman and becomes a symbol. The symbol can be used by anyone. The press uses her to sell papers. Reformers use her as evidence of rural superstition. Nationalists sometimes distance from her story to protect Ireland's image. Outsiders use her to mock Irish backwardness. Locals use her as a warning about gossip, modernity, or women who stand out. Her individuality is often flattened. Which is why, if you expand this manuscript later, one of the most powerful choices is to restore her as a full person. Not just the fairy woman. A working woman. A wife. A neighbor. A human being who did not deserve to become a parable. Chapter 15. Why it was common in Ireland. When you say this kind of thing was very common in Ireland, you're touching a truth that often gets misunderstood. It wasn't common for women to be burned alive. That is why this case shocked people. But what was common, and deeply embedded, was the framework that made such violence conceivable. Changeling belief. Suspicion of the sick. Ritual tests. Coercive cures. Communal participation. Moral permission to discipline women under the cover of protection. That structure is what was common. And it is exactly what makes this story feel both strange and familiar. Because the pattern has appeared in different cultures, in different forms, whenever communities treat identity as conditional and deviation, as evidence of possession or replacement. Ireland's folklore landscape. Ireland in the 19th century was saturated with folklore that coexisted with Catholic practice. Fairy forts, holy wells, blessings, curses, stories told as warnings rather than entertainment. These beliefs weren't always felt as superstition. They were felt as environmental realities. The landscape itself was imagined as inhabited. To step wrongly could invite harm. To offend the unseen could bring illness, misfortune, infertility, madness. In this context, a sick woman was not only a medical case. She could be read as a sign. The changelings, a social explanation for the unexplainable. Changelings offered an explanation for childhood disability, failure to thrive, postpartum depression, epilepsy, dementia, severe fever delirium, personality change due to illness, mental health crises. When medicine cannot explain, folklore fills the gap. But folklore does more than explain. It prescribes action. That's the danger. Because the explanation includes the instruction. Do this, and the real one will return. Why women were vulnerable. Women were vulnerable in this framework for several overlapping reasons. Women were culturally framed as spiritually porous, more susceptible to influence, temptation, possession. Women's bodies were sites of anxiety, menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, liminal states. Women's independence threatened order. A woman earning money and moving freely unsettled gender hierarchy. Domestic spaces were female spaces, which made domestic crises women's fault by default. Bridget's modernity did not protect her. It may have made her a more plausible target, because she could be framed as too much. Too independent, too visible, too bold. And folklore loves a correction narrative. Violence as care. One of the most chilling features of changeling belief is how it reclassifies cruelty. The logic is, if she is taken, then hurting the substitute is saving the real woman. So violence becomes care. And once violence becomes care, people can participate while keeping their self-image intact. They can say, "We did what we had to. We tried everything. We wanted her back." This is why the Bridget Cleary case can feel like a horror story written by humans trying to be righteous. Because that is exactly what it is. Community as catalyst. In many places, violence escalates when one person dominates. In folklore violence, escalation often occurs because multiple people reinforce each other's fear. Each person's half-belief becomes stronger in the group. Each person's doubt is suppressed by group momentum. This is why, when you research similar cases, you often see gatherings, interventions, helpers, witnesses who later claim confusion, rituals described as common practice. It is not one mind. It is a social engine. The common Irish pattern. If you were to map the pattern, the common version looks like this. Person becomes ill or different. Family consults neighbors/folk healer. A ritual remedy is applied. Resistance becomes evidence. Authority, husband, elder, priest, healer, asserts certainty. Coercion escalates to force. Community later frames it as misunderstanding/tragedy. The victim is either harmed or socially erased. Bridget's case is the extreme endpoint of a spectrum that many communities had rehearsed in smaller, less lethal ways. That's why it feels both rare and familiar. Chapter 16. Law Press, and the Invention of Sincere Belief. When a community crime becomes a court case, two worlds collide. The world of local explanation. The world of state explanation. The Bridget Cleary case sits right at the fault line. Because the law needed a motive that fit legal categories. And the community's story did not fit neatly. So the case had to be translated. That translation created one of the most enduring and uncomfortable ideas attached to Bridget's death: sincere belief. What the court needed. A murder trial is, at its core, a story-shaping machine. The court needs to decide who did what, with what intent, under what mental state, under what influence, and with what degree of responsibility. In modern cases, intent can be framed as jealousy, rage, greed, fear. In Bridget's case, intent had to pass through folklore. The court could not fully accept folklore as reality, because that would legitimize it. But it could not ignore folklore either, because folklore shaped the actions of the accused and the testimony of witnesses. So the court reached for a concept that does something very useful. It acknowledges belief without validating belief. That concept is sincere belief. It allows the legal system to say, they truly believed something, without saying that something was true. And once belief becomes a legal fact, it can start functioning like a partial shield. Sincere belief as mitigation. In many systems, when people act under an honestly held belief, the law sometimes treats their intent differently. Not because the belief is correct, but because the belief changes the psychological story of what happened. If a man kills because he believes he is killing an intruder, the law evaluates that belief. Was it reasonable? Was it reckless? Was it invented after the fact? In Bridget's case, the belief was not about an intruder. It was about identity itself. Michael Cleary's worldview as presented allowed him to believe, this is not my wife. That belief, if accepted as sincere, disrupts the normal simplicity of marital murder. It introduces the possibility that the accused acted within a delusional framework. And delusion can soften public understanding, even if the act is still condemned. This is why courts can become uneasy in cases like this, because they must hold two truths at once. A woman was murdered. The murder was committed under a belief system that many witnesses shared. That second truth is socially explosive. It implicates not just the accused, but the culture. The press as a second court. If the courtroom is a story-shaping machine, the press is a story-selling machine. The newspapers were not neutral recorders. They shaped the public interpretation through tone, language, and emphasis. The Bridget Cleary case offered irresistible ingredients. Superstition in an age of progress. Rural Ireland as a spectacle. Female death with bizarre motive. The fairy theme, sensational by nature. A crowd of villagers and a priest. The stark violence of fire. But the press had its own needs. It needed a narrative that readers could consume. This happened because these people are backward. That framing reassures the reader. We are not like them. It turns horror into comfort through distance. It also protects modern institutions by implying the violence came from old superstition, not from structures that still exist: misogyny, coercion, communal complicity. Ireland's image problem. There is another layer here. Ireland in the late 19th century was not just a place. It was a political symbol. Colonial dynamics mattered. Irish people were frequently represented as irrational, primitive, incapable of self-governance. So when Irish rural violence was reported, it did not land in a neutral space. It fed stereotypes. That meant the Bridget Cleary story could be used in two opposing ways. Outsiders used it to mock Irish backwardness. Irish leaders might distance from it to protect national dignity. Either way, Bridget became a pawn in an image war. And when a victim becomes a symbol in a political struggle, her humanity gets diluted. The legal comfort of superstition. Calling the motive superstition sounds like condemnation. But it can also function like a convenient container. Because superstition makes violence seem like an aberration. A weird anomaly. A leftover. A relic. It implies the solution is simply education and time. But Bridget's case is not only about superstition. It is about the power of husbands, the vulnerability of sick women, community enforcement of conformity, fear of female autonomy, the reclassification of violence as correction. Those forces do not vanish when superstition vanishes. They adapt. That is why this story still feels alive. Because the structures beneath it are recognizable. The court's dilemma: how many guilty? Another uncomfortable question. If many people participated, held her down, watched, permitted, then how many people are guilty? Courts generally prefer neat guilt. One perpetrator. A clear act. A clear motive. Group crimes threaten that neatness. Because group crimes raise the possibility that the courtroom could become a mirror held up to the community. And legal systems often shy away from indicting entire communities. So responsibility tends to be narrowed. The primary figure is emphasized. Others become influenced, confused, present, not fully aware. This is not always conscious injustice. It is the system's instinct to preserve the idea that society is mostly orderly. Bridget's fate as a narrative compromise. By the time the case entered public record, it had already passed through multiple filters. Local silence, community reinterpretation, police investigation, courtroom narrative needs, press sensationalism, national and colonial politics. Bridget's death becomes a compromise between these forces, and the compromise often produces a story that is both dramatic and incomplete. A fairy burning, a superstition murder, a bizarre rural tragedy. Those labels make the case memorable, but they also simplify it. They allow people to look away from the deeper mechanics. Chapter 17. Gender, Control, and Public Discipline. If you strip the case down to its skeletal structure, you see something that appears in many societies. A woman deviates. A woman becomes difficult. A woman becomes different. A woman is corrected through coercion framed as care. Bridget Cleary's death is folklore violence, but it is also gender violence. The two are not separate. The folklore gives the gender violence a costume, a justification, a script. Bridget as too much. One reason Bridget stood out is that she did not fit the ideal rural feminine model. She had her own trade, her own mobility, her own style, her own voice. In communities where female respectability is tied to modesty, dependence, and deference, a woman like Bridget can become a lightning rod. Even if no one consciously intends harm, the community does not have to hate her. It only has to interpret her independence as destabilizing. And when a destabilizing woman becomes ill, the illness can be read as punishment, possession, or moral disorder. Husband authority as spiritual authority. Michael Cleary was not only a husband. In a patriarchal household structure, the husband often functions as the primary interpreter of reality. His judgment is treated as default. His fear becomes priority. His anger becomes justified concern. That is why, when he declared suspicion, the suspicion gained traction. If a wife says, "I am sick," she is describing herself. If a husband says she is not herself, he is defining her. That is the difference. Women's bodies as sites of communal anxiety. In changeling folklore, women's bodies are central. A woman can be stolen, replaced, made barren, made wrong, corrupted, taken away. These stories reflect a deeper cultural anxiety. Women create life. Women are unpredictable. Women are liminal. In patriarchal systems, liminality is feared. So liminal women are regulated. In Bridget's case, the regulation escalated to annihilation. Public discipline through private violence. The event happened in a cottage. But it was not merely private. It carried a public disciplinary message. This is what happens when disorder enters the household. This is what happens when a woman becomes wrong. This is what happens when a husband loses certainty. Whether or not anyone consciously intended it, such events teach communities. They become warning stories. And warning stories often attach to women who stand out. That's why Bridget's story endured. Not only because it was violent, but because it was usable. The tragedy of rescue narratives. The rescue framing is what makes this case especially disturbing. Because it means perpetrators can see themselves as saviors. A husband can harm and still feel righteous. Neighbors can assist and still feel helpful. The victim becomes the obstacle to her own rescue, because her resistance is interpreted as the substitute resisting cure. That is the most twisted feature of changeling violence. It builds a moral trap that makes compassion serve brutality. Modern echoes. Even without folklore, societies still do versions of this. They label women hysterical, unstable, dramatic, manipulative, not herself, crazy. And once the label sticks, coercion becomes easier. Bridget's story is a 19th century case with a fairy script. But the deeper script, the disciplining of women under the cover of concern, is not confined to 1895. Conclusion. Bridget Cleary did not die because she lived in a superstitious age. She died because belief was allowed to override care, authority was allowed to operate without restraint, and violence was permitted to masquerade as remedy. These were not relics of the medieval past. They were features of late 19th century society, operating within sight of doctors, police, courts, and newspapers. This matters, because it dismantles the most comfortable version of the story. To describe Bridget Cleary as the last witch burned in Ireland is to distance her death from modernity, to imply that such violence belongs safely behind us. It allows the present to imagine itself immune. The historical record does not support that comfort. Bridget was killed in 1895, in a society with railways, newspapers, and a functioning legal system. She was not beyond help. She was abandoned by it. Belief did not act alone. Fairy folklore provided language, but power provided permission. Bridget was a married woman whose independence unsettled her husband. She earned her own income. She moved between households. She spoke for herself. When she became ill, her resistance to submission was reinterpreted as absence. The changeling narrative did not create that suspicion, it made it legible. What followed was not sudden madness. It was escalation. Interrogation became coercion. Coercion became punishment. Punishment became destruction. Each step was normalized by repetition and by the presence of others who failed to intervene. Responsibility dissolved into community, and community into belief. The legal response completed the pattern. The court acknowledged the violence but declined to name it murder. It accepted sincerity of belief as sufficient to fracture intent, even in the face of sustained torture and concealment. The verdict of manslaughter did not deny that Bridget had been killed, it denied the full moral weight of how she had been killed. In doing so, the law placed Bridget's suffering second to Michael Cleary's state of mind. Her pain became evidence. His belief became explanation. This inversion is not unique to her case. It is a recurring feature of systems that struggle to confront violence when it aligns with authority, tradition, or cultural narrative. Bridget Cleary's death exposes how readily institutions will reach for classification over accountability when belief offers an escape route. Her legacy has been shaped by that same impulse. Folklore has been used to explain her death, to soften it, to make it strange enough to be safely distant. Yet nothing about Bridget's life was unreal. She worked. She argued. She resisted. She tried to save herself. What happened to her was not a story. It was a process. Returning Bridget Cleary to history requires refusing the myths that followed her death. It requires naming what was done to her as torture, not misunderstanding, as domestic violence, not superstition, as collective failure, not individual tragedy. It also requires recognizing the persistence of the structures that enabled her killing. Belief has not disappeared. It has changed shape. Authority still seeks justification. Women's resistance is still pathologized. Violence is still softened when it can be framed as care, fear, or confusion. Bridget Cleary's story endures because it forces us to confront these continuities. She was not taken by fairies. She was taken by a society that found it easier to believe a story than to protect a woman. Remembering her truthfully is not an act of folklore. It is an act of responsibility. Bibliography. Primary sources, contemporary to the case. Freeman's Journal, Dublin. March, April 1895. Trial reports, witness testimony, and inquest summaries relating to the death of Bridget Cleary. Irish Times, Dublin. March, April 1895. Contemporary reporting on the investigation, inquest, trial proceedings, verdicts, and sentencing. Nenagh Guardian. 1895. Regional reporting on the disappearance of Bridget Cleary, discovery of her body, arrests, and court proceedings. Clonmel Chronicle. 1895. Local coverage of the Cleary case, including community response and trial summaries. The Times, London. 1895. National British reporting on the trial and verdict, reflecting contemporary imperial attitudes to Irish rural life and belief. Bendigo Advertiser, Victoria. June 8, 1895. The Clonmel Witch Case. Reprinted British commentary and courtroom quotations, illustrating international reception of the case. Coroner's Inquest Reports, Tipperary. 1895. As reproduced in Irish regional and national newspapers. Legal and government sources. Offences Against the Person Act 1861, UK/Ireland. Statutory framework governing homicide, manslaughter, and penalties in late 19th century Ireland. Irish Crown Court Proceedings, Clonmel Assizes, 1895. Trial summaries and indictments as reported in contemporary newspapers. Victorian Irish Public Health and Medical Practice Reports. Late 19th century. Folklore and Cultural Context, Primary and Early Secondary. National Folklore Collection, Ireland. Accounts of fairy belief, changelings, and ritual practices collected in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Victorian-era folklore collections documenting Irish fairy belief and changeling narratives. Secondary sources, modern scholarship. Burke, Angela. The Burning of Bridget Cleary. London, Pimlico, 1999. A foundational modern study of the case, used here as a contextual guide rather than a definitive authority, and cross-checked against contemporaneous sources. Ferreiter, Dermot. The Transformation of Ireland 1900 to 2000. London, Profile Books, 2004. Luddy, Maria. Women in Ireland, 1800 to 1918. Cork, Cork University Press, 1995. Essential for understanding gender roles, marriage, and female autonomy in late 19th century Ireland. O'Giolan, D. Armwood. Locating Irish Folklore, Tradition, Modernity, Identity. Cork, Cork University Press, 2000. Analysis of folklore as a living belief system rather than a static tradition. McMahon, Richard. Crime, Law and Popular Culture in Ireland. Dublin, Irish Academic Press, 2008. Useful for understanding jury behaviour, legal mitigation, and popular responses to crime. Methodological note. This work relies heavily on contemporary newspaper reporting, as no complete verbatim trial transcript survives. Where accounts diverge, interpretations are based on points of consistency across multiple independent sources. Later folklore and secondary analyses are used critically and never substituted for contemporaneous evidence.